It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce the next keynote speaker for us today, Professor Mara Einstein. I met Mara through actually my co-writer of the book that I've done last year, Justin Kirby, and she really opened up for me the issue of online ethics to such an extent actually that I've devised, based on various things that Mara told me and written about in her book, Black Ops Advertising. Also, other kind of research, I developed a narrative and talk of my own that is now kind of really successfully being deployed globally. The time is right, obviously, to talk about it within the marketing community as well, because they seem a little bit kind of tone deaf to ethics. However, Mara is going to give us a whistle-stop tour through some of the key challenges that the digital media revolution has presented to the both media ecosystem and the consumers and citizens, and particularly also to the question of what is real on the internet and what is not. And is there a way for us to tell that? And what should we do about it if there are challenges, and I'm not going to say problems, with that particular paradigm, that particular set of dynamics. So please welcome Professor Mara Einstein from Queens College, City University, New York.
Everybody's coming in. Come on in. Give everybody a second. Okay. Yeah, we're starting a little early. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to come talk with everybody today. And since it's after lunch, what I thought I would do, so my talk is a little bit different than what's in the program. Start talking about media, but the problem with media right now is it's blurring this line between what is media and what is advertising. So my conversation that I'm going to have with you today is an extension of my work of Black Ops advertising and where I see it moving forward right now. So one of the things that I want to talk about, and since it's after lunch, I'm going to do a little test, see how good you are in terms of understanding what is native advertising. So who knows what this is? Anybody seen this? Anybody know? What is this?
The lecturer is allowed to raise the hand.
Yeah, well, yes. Yes, okay. This is called Fearless Girl. Fearless Girl is a statue that is across from the Bull on Wall Street. And if you ever do come to New York and you happen to get down to Wall Street, what you will probably find is a whole lot of tourists standing around the Fearless Girl, taking their picture and posting it to social media. But what you should know about Fearless Girl is actually advertising. Fearless Girl was created by State Street Global Advisors, and they did it as a means to bring attention to the lack of women in senior positions on Wall Street and on corporate boards. Now, if we were going to do a feminist talk about this, we could talk about the fact of using a girl to talk about women's issues. What we could also talk about is the fact that State Street Partners was fined $5 million for a discrimination gap in terms of their pay between men and women. So that's some of the things you won't find when you're talking about this particular piece of advertising. This was Lady Gaga when she was doing a tribute to David Bowie on the Grammy Awards a couple of years ago. Native advertising? Not native advertising. Yes, someone's saying yes. Anyone else think this is native advertising? Does anybody know what it is for? Branding for David Bowie? You would think that. It's not really. If it comes up.
Technology certainly matters to me. It has a really profound way that it can affect stage performance and take it to another level.
In 2015, Intel approached Lady Gaga and asked, how would you use Intel technology in your performance?
It was actually for
It
was actually for Intel. It wasn't for David Bowie, it wasn't for Lady Gaga, it wasn't for the Grammys, it was for Intel. And in conjunction with this was a whole slew of videos and content that appeared online in conjunction with this particular piece of content. Anyone know this? Woolly. Woolly used to be called Van Winkles and was changed to Woolly. Native advertising, not native advertising. We don't know. This was a trick question. This is branded content. This is branded content, and branded content, the difference between branded content and native advertising is branded content is commercial content that doesn't have a sales pitch in it. It will give you all kinds of information about a product, but it won't have a sales pitch. And what you'll see on this particular website, if you went to it, is at the bottom it tells you what Woolly is, and all the way at the bottom, which is a little hard to see, it says, this is a Casper ad, and this is what our attorneys said that we had to put on this particular piece of content. So just to be a little more specific about what native advertising is and what branded content is, so native advertising is advertising that is indigenous to the site within which it exists. So if you were going to see an ad on Facebook, it looks like this. It has the ghosted out sponsored underneath the name of the organization that is posting it, usually has that little bar that says learn more. Now this is a screenshot from off a computer, but most of us aren't looking at it on a computer. Most of us are looking at it on our cell phones. And so it's this much more streamlined space within which we're looking at this. The same thing is true if you were going to look at something on Twitter. This looks like it could be an article that's posted by just about anybody, but in fact you see at the very bottom it says promoted, very small type, ghosted out. And again, what we're starting to see more on Twitter, and one of the theme I'll keep coming back to over the course of this conversation, is that video content and very highly produced video content is one of the main trends that's going on in the industry right now. But even if it's not video content, it will be something that's very small, has the promoted at the bottom of it. This is something off Instagram, because I know everybody uses Instagram. But one of these is native advertising, and one of them is not. And it's really hard to see. And unfortunately, on this slide, you can't really see it. But what this says is paid partnership with Target. So this one here on your right is advertising, but the one on the left is not. And unless you're really taking the time to look at this, it's very difficult to discern, particularly if you're looking at this on very small screens. The other form of native advertising, and one that is becoming particularly popular, is what's known as custom native advertising. Custom native is advertising that tends to be produced by the publisher of the content. So this is something that was produced by the New York Times. This was the first piece of custom native that they produced. It was about women inmates, and it was actually for a Netflix series called Orange is the New Black. One of the things that people who are proponents of native advertising will say is, well, we're providing information about something that we as a publisher would not put funding behind. We can't afford to do an in-depth investigative report on what is women inmates, and that's fine. And some of this kind of content is sort of innocuous, and that's okay. The ones that start to bother me are things like Chevron Oil doing a piece on sustainability, or this one that's for Discover Card, which is a credit card company that is, the line is, college is still worth it despite rising costs. Actually, my new work is about higher education, marketing higher education, and there's debate right now about whether or not paying $75,000 to go to college in the United States is actually worth it. Most students don't have their college paid for. They're paying for it with a combination of government loans and some scholarships, but oftentimes it's not all paid for, and so a company like the Discover Card will happily make up the difference for students at a much higher interest rate. So they have a vested interest in saying that going to college is a good thing. So one of the things that I want to point out to you, and part of this discussion, is not only are the forms of content changing in terms of advertising, but also how we consume them. So this just shows you that rising green bar is more time that's being spent on mobile as opposed to laptop. What's also increasing is the amount of video, and I'm sure you all are feeling this yourselves, right? Is that you're not reading content, but rather that you're going to YouTube or watching video that advertisers are sending to you. The other form that's happening, and I'm going to give you some ideas of where this is going, partner content is very small type above the title, above the headline. This is from Wired magazine or Wired website. And then on the bottom, it'll say this content was produced by Wired Brand Lab in collaboration with HP. And most of these companies, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post, they're all called like Brand Lab, which is a really interesting name to call your advertising department, because really that's what it is. This is a piece from the Washington Post for a company called Optimum, and I don't know if this is going to click through. It didn't click through. I will make these slides available to you, and they have web links embedded into it. If you go to see the site, this is very high-end, highly produced content. This has multiple layers of graphics that show you. This is talking about the opioid epidemic. And this shows you how the medical content within opioids affect the nervous system. They talk about the rise of the opioid epidemic within the United States. And it's not until the very last screen, which most people will never get to, that you find out that it's from an insurance data aggregator. This is for Courageous. Courageous is the branded content area for CNN, the news guys, right? This has become a very large area for them, and they too, yeah, I'm not getting the video. That's okay. You can even see from this, very highly produced video. They're doing content for all kinds of advertisers, from Chevy trucks to I'm trying to think of some of the other ones I've done, but they're using very high-end, top-of-the-line advertisers and creating very high-end content for them. Another arm of CNN is this area called Great Big Story. Great Big Story is part of CNN, but it's a particular division that was created to target millennials, because I know that CNN isn't exactly a site that a lot of millennials are going to, and they don't, and so young people weren't going to that, so they created Great Big Story. A lot of the content on Great Big Story is video content. This one happens to be about a mixed martial artist, and it's brought to you by Singapore Airlines. This is another piece about a cartoonist who was making her way around the West Coast and hiking through the mountains and so on. And hopefully you'll be able to read this. So I looked at some of the comments on YouTube about this. And so you get things like this is so beautiful. Also, what's the song at the beginning, right? So people are really engaging with the content. They really like it a lot. But then you get this. This is a Coors Light commercial, WTF, screw you. Okay, and this is part of the issue with this, is some people understand that they're engaging with commercial content, and a lot of people do not. And actually my husband is sitting here. This is a picture. I got married a little less than 2 years ago, and my husband and I stood in front of this picture, and it was on a billboard that's on a wall in Brooklyn. And we knew it was an ad for Delta, right? There's a big Delta logo on it, and we knew it was an ad for Delta. What we didn't know was that it was also an ad for Tinder. Do you guys know what Tinder is? Okay. So even those of us who work in the field sometimes get caught not knowing that we're engaging in real life with native advertising. Okay, so there is this content confusion, and what we know is that 17% of participants recognize native advertising, and this was research that was done out of the University of Georgia in 2015. This was then replicated 2 years later, and again, 17% recognized native advertising. And when they were forewarned, if people are told ahead of time what to look for, then it went up to 27%. But that's still not a large number of people knowing what this content is. And I know you're going to say, wait, but millennials will know. No, millennials don't know either. And in fact, Stanford did some research with middle schoolers and with college-age students, and this was in 2016, and only 82% of middle schoolers could not distinguish journalistic content from advertising. So this is something that continues to be of concern because there's this very blurred line between editorial content and advertising content. And what's also important to understand about this is that the use of native advertising negatively affects media outlets when readers know it is sponsored content. So the issue is not with advertisers. People don't get angry with advertisers when they learn about native advertising. They're angry with the publishers that they've tried to hoodwink them into believing the content they were engaging with did not have a sponsor behind it. So this starts to become an issue when we think in terms of things like fake news, right? Because people are believing the content that is in a publication is supposed to be legitimate editorial content. Some of you that are marketers, right, recognize the old marketing funnel. But the issue, and this is from David Rogers. David Rogers is a marketing professor at Columbia University, and he talks about this in his book, The Digital Transformation Playbook. And it used to be, we talk about awareness and consideration, and this is the landscape that consumers go through when they are considering buying a product. And in the old world, you started in terms of creating awareness through TV and radio and outdoor and so on. Consideration, you're going to target people more directly, so you're going to use direct mail and brochures and move people down the funnel until they become advocates for your product or your brand. But today, that area starts to get a bit more blurry because you start out with search and buzz and blogs, going into online research, and then what you're actually trying to get people to do in terms of advocacy, which is much more important in the social space, is reviews and links and likes and social buzz, because that's where the real payoff is for marketers. Mary Meeker, if you don't know Mary Meeker, you should know Mary Meeker. Mary Meeker is with Kleiner Perkins, which is a VC firm that invests highly in the digital space. She comes out with this report on internet trends every May. So this is 2018 because the new one hasn't come out yet. But what you can see in these sites is the funnel has been utterly collapsed. Because what happens in the digital space is you have the place of creating awareness and the place where you can buy the product happening in the same place. So the content has become the store, and the ad has become the transaction, because they're one and the same thing. So in summary of what I've gone over thus far is there's this continued increase in video over static, seamlessly integrating digital and legacy media, right? So we have Lady Gaga, she's both on television as well as online, rethinking the sales funnel and the consumer decision process. And the reason why all of this is important is this issue of word of mouth, which is what I was talking about in terms of the bottom of the funnel. This is slightly older data, but in terms of a visual, I think it's really helpful. Who uses each of these different services? And Facebook, amazingly, is still far and away ahead of other platforms. But it's also important to think in terms of, and this number is wrong, right? This is 2.2. Facebook is what, at 2.7 now, billion users. But it's also important to think in terms of other places where people share, Pinterest and Spotify and Netflix. But I also thought it was interesting to take a look at how platforms are being used by age. Certainly, Facebook is still up there. YouTube, right, and particularly with younger peoples, it's way off the chart, 91% for 18 to 29-year-olds. And what's also interesting to look at, because I'm about to get into my conversation of influencers, because I'm supposed to talk to young people, and I know young people really care about influencers, is Instagram, right? And most influencers are primarily use Instagram. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about why we share the work of Jonah Berger, who is a marketing professor at the Wharton School at Penn. He wrote a book called Contagious, but he also has a lot of academic reading if you want to look at that as well. And he talks about why it is that we share. And some of this is you know, sort of old hat for those of us who study media, so this idea of social currency, right? You want to be in the know, you want to know what's happening, so you want to be able to share in the social conversation. What is really important in the online space is this idea of emotion, particularly awe and anger. And really, if you want to think about this in terms of the conversations that happened earlier today in terms of politics, think of when you've sent something forward to somebody else. When have you shared something? So when something really made you angry, or really inspired you, or really made you sad, but it's something that really pushed an emotional button for you, and that's certainly something that marketers understand better than anybody else. The other person I would bring your attention to is Nicholas John, who wrote a book called The Age of Sharing. And one of the things that he talks about is the languaging that's used on these sites, particularly Facebook. We talk about sharing content. You're not forwarding the content like you do in your email, you're sharing the content. And that puts a very different frame on it. The idea that we're part of a community, but are we really part of a community? And so those kinds of words and that kind of language and that framing of this space is really important. This I just wanted to touch on quickly, and just in case people aren't aware of this. In the online space, there's 3 ways that we think in terms of media. The first is paid, which is traditional advertising, paying for an ad on Facebook or any of these other platforms. Owned media is anything that is owned by the brand company. It can be their website, it can be their Twitter feed, their Instagram, and so on. But all of that is in service of the earned. What marketers are trying to do more than anything else is to get us to share the content. Because we don't buy because an advertiser told us to buy something, we buy because a friend told us to buy it, or a colleague, or a family member. And so the more we can engage the friends and family into selling the products for us, the better we are. So this brings me to influencers, and influencers is what I see as the next sort of round of what is happening in terms of black ops advertising. And I'm going to read a little bit here. So while content is important, the purveyor of that content is paramount for marketers. As online interactions demand more personal, more emotional connection, advertisers turn to influencers to sell their products. So Forbes, for instance, has lists of some of the top influencers, and so these are some of the people that you might be interested in or might be familiar with. And all of these sites do these things where they let you know how many followers they have on all of these various and sundry social media. So influencers provide advertisers with significant advantages. First, influencers have created relationships, and here we go, trusting, remember that word, trusting, authentic relationships with their followers, which makes them perfect brand ambassadors. Second, initially used simply as mouthpieces, today they are used as content producers and as part of integrating message network systems. This level of customization enables higher engagement levels than other digital formats. Think of this for just a minute. The influencer is the ad. The influencer is the ad. Content can be as simple as a product review or as complex as multi-platform, fully integrated campaigns where the influencer and brand work together to create a sales message that works for both parties. Third, influencers offer a two-way conversation. Consumers might interact with a brand, but they are far more likely to have a conversation with one of their favorite YouTubers. And unlike brands, influencers are entertaining and relatable. They evoke emotion and have a relationship with the visitor on the channel the audience opted into. Finally, they provide quantifiable results, both in terms of engagement as well as how successful the influencer has been in turning viewers into brand advocates, the goal of the vast majority of these campaigns. But typically when we think about influencers, we think of these influencers with very large followings. And so most of the influencers, when advertisers are looking for them, have been put into various verticals, verticals being product categories. So the top one is beauty, and these happen to be the 10 biggest influencers in the beauty category. And the value for advertisers is that, you know, I could use one of these influencers, but if I use 10, I can reach a whole lot more people. There are also a growing number of types of influencers, not just getting influencers that have 20 million people or 30 million people, but smaller influencers, micro-influencers, and now nano-influencers. And the ways that advertisers can connect with them are a lot through these very simple online platforms, and they simply put out a call for a certain type of influencer, and that influencer responds and says that they want to be part of the advertising. So broadly, there's thousands of influencers ranging from having a few thousand followers to many millions of followers. Influencers with a few hundred followers can be beneficial to advertisers if their followers are loyal and passionate in relationship to a particular product niche. Influencers like Beyonce or Lady Gaga provide loyalty as well as media tonnage. So the thinking goes, if one influencer is good, then 2 or 10 or 20 is better. So I kept this because I thought it was interesting to see the difference between 2017 and 2018. And what these graphs show is the number of influencers that advertisers use for a particular campaign. So the first is 1 to 10, then it's 2 to 25, 25 to 50, and then much larger. But what you see is that advertisers usually use between 1 and 10. And that number has grown. The number of 10 to 25 has gone down, but the number of 25 to 50 has shot up significantly between last year and this year. And so advertisers are starting to use this idea of an influencer network far more than they used to. And so there are what we used to think of in terms of the digital space was content farms. Right, and so all of these journalists who could no longer get jobs were suddenly writing branded content. Now what we have is the same sort of thing happening in the influencer area. So what you have is companies that are keeping pools of influencers, thousands and thousands of influencers that they can connect to advertisers. And so this was a campaign for a company called Collectively, and they put this campaign together for Sephora, and what you just see on the bottom is through this campaign, they reached 65 million people using influencers, which is certainly broadcast television kind of numbers. Overall, they have 6,500 people in there that work with them that send out 72 million posts over the course of a week. This is another example for a company called Tidal Labs that they did something with Banana Republic. What was interesting to me was when I talked to somebody who worked there, I said, oh, so it's a broadcast model. You're taking the content from a particular area and you're disseminating it through a whole bunch of affiliates, but you're calling them influencers. He's like, no, don't think of it that way. I was like, well, why not? He's like, no, don't think of it that way. I said, but it is that, right? He goes, yeah, but don't think of it that way. I was like, okay. This is also really interesting. This is a company called Hyperbrands. What Hyperbrands does is collect all the data on millions of influencers. So you can, I'm sorry it included Donald Trump, I'm sorry, but this was what happened. And Kardashian, I try to avoid the Kardashian, so between Trump and Kardashian, I really hit the doubles here. But you can see some of the information in terms of how many followers they have on all of the various social media. And this is what advertisers use to figure out who they want to connect with, who is the influencer they want to use. So we go back to Jenna Marbles, and if you look at an individual influencer, you can get all kinds of information in terms of what countries, what media platforms they use, the education level, all kinds of in-depth data about who follows these particular influencers. And then, of course, the most important piece of information that advertisers want to know is what is the engagement level. And anyone can go into this. You can just ask for an account and go on to Hyper, and you can find out all this data yourself. And then what they also have case studies on there, and this particular one was for a golf outing that they wanted to find an influencer, and this influencer was somebody who would go around and shake hands with people at the event and so on. And the reason why this is really important is that in terms of influencer spending, by 2020 it's going to be between $5 and $10 billion, and $2.3 billion of that is going to happen on Instagram. But what are the issues? What are the issues when it comes to influencers? Does anybody know who this is? I see one head. Two. Anybody else? Three. Okay. This is Michaela. This is little Michaela. Michaela is not real. Michaela is CGI. Oh, yeah. This is a huge trend. And one of the things that people are saying is, well, by the time I've taken a picture of a model and retouched her, she's not real anyway. So I might as well start with CGI and have somebody who's not going to be a pain in the neck, and she's going to do whatever I tell her to do. Kids, little kids, kids who can't even verbalize the advertising, the message that the advertiser wants them to say. This is another trend. Fake Instagram influencers. So this is a famous one, is Cowgirl, Cali Girl, C-A-L-I Girl. So what the company did is they tried to test whether or not they could get away with making a fake Instagram account. And so they bought followers and they bought the engagements. And once you reach 10,000 followers, then you can be part of an influencer network. And so they were able to use this fake account to get advertisers to buy. But then it becomes an issue because it's not a real person. Fire Festival, you guys aware of Fire Festival here? Yeah, okay, so we have the issue with Fire Festival overall, right? These influencers and people following them and so on for an event that didn't really happen. But there's also this documentary on Netflix called Fire, right? And excuse my language here, Fire and part of the marketing team behind the Fire Festival was a company called Fuck Jerry. And that company was trying to recreate its image to be Jerry Media. And so the executive producer of the Fire documentary on Netflix is actually the head of the company of Jerry Media. So they were using this documentary to change their business and to reframe who they were. So that was also a way for them to hide who they were within that content. So to wrap up, because my time is fast going away, some broader issues in terms of ethics in advertising in the post-digital age. One book I would bring your attention to is Brooke Duffy's book, Not Getting Paid for What You Love. In this book, she has spent 2 years doing ethnography with fashion and beauty influencers, and the vast majority of them do not get paid. She talks about this issue of aspirational labor, and some of you, particularly students, may know this idea of working really hard and spending a lot of time on Instagram and creating followers and all of that sort of thing, only to find out it's not a place where you're actually going to make any money. Coming from Alyssa Quartz's book, Squeezed, this perpetuates and obscures the key issue, which is the idea of the gig economy and the side hustle. And what is being obscured is the idea that we're not being paid a fair wage for the jobs that we do. And if we were, we wouldn't have to have a side hustle. And this is just to show you how little people are paid in terms of the number of followers they have. So these are people who have followers in the size of 100 to 150,000 people. Most are getting paid, maybe up to $500 for a post, but they're not being paid the $40,000 or the $75,000 that the big celebrities are. And in fact, the vast majority of them are being paid in kind meaning that they're paid with product and not with money. I would also bring your attention to the book Anti-Social Media. And the issue with this is that, when you're talking about, this is really about Facebook, but I would say it also transfers to a lot of other social media. The revenue model is based on advertising. Period. It is based on advertising. It depends mostly on AI to police the content, and there is absolutely no motivation for them to change. Importantly, they own Instagram, and Instagram is the place where most of the influencers are spending their time. And I include this chart so you can see the visual on this. This is the direct line up of how much money Facebook is making per user, right? So even though there's little blips when Zuckerberg goes and talks to Congress, right, and it takes a little dip, but that's just a dip, and it starts to go back up again. If you haven't seen this movie called The Cleaners, and it is about the people in the Philippines who are watching the content to decide what should go onto Facebook and what should be eliminated. This is a quote of what she's, I've seen hundreds of beheadings. And this is not just happening in the Philippines, it's also in Silicon Valley at the Facebook headquarters. Most of these people have PTSD. They have to decide within 10 to 15 seconds what should be allowed and what should not be allowed. And the problem with this is that you can't really determine the context within that particular period of time. And look, with all the money that Facebook is making, they could hire a lot more people and give people more than 10 to 15 seconds to decide whether or not content should appear on their site. I'm sure you've heard of this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I will admit to you that I have not had time to read all 690 pages of the book yet, but the overall context of this, right, advertising was not originally supposed to be the revenue behind these platforms. It wasn't until after the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s that all of this VC money had gone into all these digital platforms, but none of these people had created a revenue model for how they were going to make money. All of a sudden, after the dot-com boom, people said, okay, how are we going to do this? And they fell back on what was the traditional model, which was aggregate eyeballs so we can sell advertising against it. And that's where we are now. And they also realized they had amassed tremendous amounts of data on their visitors and then could use that within the advertising platform. The problem is people are unaware. Their information is being amassed. The awareness is increasing, but and as I say with my students understand that the information is being amassed. What they don't understand is that can have consequences like keeping you from getting health insurance or keeping you from getting a mortgage or keeping you from getting a job, and you won't know why. From Mark Zuckerberg, who I'm loath to quote, but I'll quote him on this one. We're an idealistic and optimistic company. For the first decade, we really focused on all the good that connecting people brings. But it's clear now that we, Facebook, didn't do enough. And this goes into the whole ethos of Silicon Valley, that it was about connecting a world. It was about creating this utopian world that we were all going to live in and share and so on. We didn't focus enough on preventing abuse and thinking through how people could use these tools to do harm as well. And that's the problem. In traditional areas, companies had to think through some of those ideas, but when you get as big as Facebook, you don't have to do that and nobody's going to tell you no. The other place where we see this, and this just happened to be on my Twitter feed a couple of nights ago, is Twitter, I'm going to bed in 5 minutes, Twitter, LOLK, right? So the companies are laughing at us. They're laughing at us. They know they have created persuasive technologies that keep us connected and tied into interacting with their advertising all the time. And they know they're doing it, and they're laughing at us. So the last thing I would say about this is a couple of books that have come out recently. One is called How to Break Up with Your Phone. It's not to eliminate it, but to break up with it. The other one is a book by my colleague, Douglas Rushkoff, called Team Human, and it is about how we reconnect. A lot of what has been talked about, and particularly in the panel before this, which is how do we reconnect in this world of the digital space? And just some quick concluding remarks. So people, and note I do not say consumers, are not willingly giving up their data. It is being stolen from them whether they are aware of it or not. Even if they are aware, most are not cognizant of the consequences this entails. Social media platforms have no motivation to stop these digital data gobbling and algorithmically based targeted practices, which have far-reaching consequences beyond those of advertising. Wars in Myanmar, promoting anti-vaxxing, fueling anti-Semitism, and the hacking of an American election, to name a few. Technologies embedded with persuasive design models work to keep us tethered to our phones and our tablets, even as they increase anxiety and foment hate. This cannot possibly be what we want, and if it isn't, then it has become incumbent upon us to change it. In the United States, publicly traded, privately owned media systems are not required to operate under the protective regulations of traditional media. We live in a new media environment, and regulations need to catch up with the technology, not only to protect us against foreign actors and multinational marketers, but to protect the integrity of publications whose credibility is sorely affected by these practices. We already know that most people do not recognize branded content. We can, for now, make an educated guess that they do not recognize that content is being disseminated to hundreds of influencers simultaneously, nor do they understand that topics and products are trending because of manipulation rather than being organically of interest. As more of this process is automated and people, living, breathing, thoughtful human beings, are taken out of the process, the more abuse we are likely to see or not to see. And I know we don't have time for questions, so thank you.
We do have 5 more minutes for one question, maybe two if they're short, so please do.
And these are all my coordinates if you're looking to find me.
Hi, thank you. Sorry. I want to reflect on something that happened on the panel before you. The professor said that children nowadays are trying to be more like influencers. So how do you think the future is going to look for them, and how can we make a difference on them to make them think more about the dangers of the internet, the dangers of being an influencer, dangers of being so not private, and to make them realize that they need to be ready for change?
Excellent question. A lot of people talk about media literacy. I think media literacy is okay, but I don't think it solves the problem. I think regulation can certainly help. I mean, kids under 13 in the United States are not supposed to be allowed to have these accounts, but their parents create their accounts for them. And something has to be done to make that more highly regulated. In Sweden, for instance, not on the internet but offline, you can't advertise to kids under 12. You know, I try to envision that in the United States. What would that be like if a kid under 12 didn't see a commercial? That would be really fascinating to see. I think some of it has to be social. That peer pressure in the younger ages, I think, is going to be really important. And the example that I gave with my students, like, my students know that their data is being collected, but they don't understand what the consequences of that data being collected is. And I think some of that has to be true for little kids as well. I think if they also understand this idea of aspirational labor, and that they're not going to be the next great influencer, that ship has sailed. Not only has it sailed, there's certain influencers that are saying that influencers are already last Tuesday, right? And advertisers and marketers are going to be looking for the next great thing. Because one of the things that I didn't talk about in here is regulations of influencers and how those are being enforced or not being enforced. Look, I have a 19-year-old daughter. She's online all the time. One of the things I would say to parents, not to kids, don't put your kids online. Don't. I see parents who document their kids' life on Facebook as if it's their family photo album. That's a huge mistake, and it's not fair to the kids. right? Because what happens when you grow up and you decide you don't want everybody to know when you were potty trained and when you took your first step, right? And you have no control over that. The other thing my students also say to me is, well, it's in the privacy, oh, but it's private. I hid it, it's private. Yeah, well, if that makes you feel good, yeah, right? Go ahead and think that, but it's not true. Some of it's about teaching kids the danger of it. I think regulations have to come into it. I think that, I think parents have to teach themselves about it. And what I told my daughter was, look, nothing goes on Facebook that you wouldn't want your grandmother to see. And if you can't show it to Mana, then you can't put it on Facebook. So there's no good answer, unfortunately. I wish I had a better answer than that, but that's the best I got.
Thank you very much. Once again,
oh, my water's gone.